All right, everyone, it's time for an interesting little thing about the Hong Kong protests. Because the other day, the Hong Kong protesters got together and a bunch of them were waving U.S. flags and singing the national anthem of the United States. And it's glorious because here you've got a group of people who have to live under communism. Or basically, in Hong Kong's case, a mixed model where there's hyper-capitalism and banking and investment. It's really sort of a sort of injection point for the nation of China, but it's under hardline left authoritarianism. It's still technically communism in every sense except for that part of the fiscal arrangement. And so here you've got a case where people who actually know how communism is reject it soundly. If you look at their local elections, it's like 5-1 people voting against the Chinese interests. There's a reason for that. And I've talked about this before. This plays a huge, a disproportionate role in the EU as well. Because you've got people from former Soviet states, Soviet aligned states, that are in the European Union, the Baltic states, certainly others that were behind the wall, simply under the control of the Soviet Union at the time. These people reject leftism because they've actually lived under it. Only in the decadent West that never had to suffer under socialism or communism is support for these things common. The only other aside is Latin America, where really it forms a dipole to the United States and imperialistic foreign policy that's happened under both left and right-wing administrations. World policing, of course, being inherently centralized and leftist anyway, because it requires that centralized effort in order to be maintained. World policing is not a conservative value, certainly not a libertarian one. It gets blamed on the right, though. People still think that Bush was a conservative. That's hilarious to me, considering the amount he spent on his bullshit with funny money, printing it into oblivion from out of nowhere in order to pay for bombing civilians. Very, very fiscally conservative man. Yeah, he did a lot for the American people. Wonderful leader. It's funny how people compare him, if they're on the left, favorably with Donald Trump at this point. Donald Trump never killed 500,000 Iraqis, so I don't see what the bitching is about. But it's funny to see them wave U.S. flags in Hong Kong, because here when there are protests politically, a lot of times it's people who won't even show their faces. And it's not because they're afraid of being dragged off to a gulag like the Hong Kong protesters. It's more like they're afraid of somebody doxing them on Facebook or whatever. Antifa members and others, they wave their commie flags or their so-called anarcho-communist flags, the red and black, which is kind of a misnomer. Anarchism can spawn communism, but not necessarily. Sometimes it just spawns a loose mob rule sort of situation, like a good neighbor a la Fallout 4. It's a little bit better. Sometimes it forms an anarcho-capitalistic element, but it won't last for very long because inevitably someone will have a bigger gun and they'll be running the show. This, by the way, is how authoritarianism is caused. Authority only rises out of the ashes of disorder and chaos anyway, during a revolution or in the primordial sense before the concept of statehood existed. And then usually it's corrupt, which is why when you've got an orderly system imposed that's actually stable, you should seek to maintain it, and if there are problems, to reform it from within. That's what I suggest for the U.S. Yeah, we should slash the government size by 90%. Yeah, the tax rate should be less than half of what it currently is on all echelons of society. Most of our laws suck ass. But that doesn't mean I want to crash and burn the system. I think the state itself works just fine. It's just you need reform of it. These people want communism in the United States. Yeah, no thanks. I can see actual communism in action over in Hong Kong. They're busy waving the U.S. flag, begging for help. They're begging for us to take them all in as refugees or to come in with the Navy and safeguard them against Chinese incursions, which unfortunately is impossible to do. They're basically enslaved. They're basically surrounded by a billion actual communists. They want mild reform. They're not even arguing for the abolition of the communist state technically there. They're arguing for, hey, we want more liberalism. We want to have basic freedom of expression so that we don't get thrown into prison for saying, oh, maybe the Chinese government was wrong when it gassed this group of people. Maybe the Chinese government was wrong to put 100,000 Islamic people in concentration camps. I find that's another funny thing. I'll give both sides of this story. The situation is this. The Chinese government is trying to assimilate groups that are semi-separatist, and I can sort of kind of understand that, but the methodology which is being used is so primitive and so brutal. that nobody else in the world can possibly with a straight face defend it. That being said, of course, you've got fanatic elements there that carry out bombings the same as you tend to have among more religious groups of society. China tends to be heavily atheistic, but when you've got this particular situation going on, China's got to understand it's going to be held to the same standards that other nations are. The United States hands ammo to its enemies when it does dumb things. The nation of China often does the same. But they act very self-righteous about it because you're not allowed to question the state there because it's like part of that particular communistic culture. I would say this. People in the United States need to pay attention to the Hong Kong protesters because these are people who several generations ago, before China fell to communism, had a state that was making some attempts to liberalize. China at the time was industrially backwards. It had a lot of problems in the wake of some of the famines. It was going through a transitory phase. Communism took hold in that particular era and did far worse. It's like people want to talk about Japanese imperialism. Well, they were trying to fight the Japanese off. Yes, and then the end result was worse. Look at all the people that died under General Mao. Mao Zedong, who was a lazy fuck and had to be carried around in a chair all the time while everyone else was starving, and he literally, I guess, had one of those things where dudes would hoist him up with sticks, no pun there intended, up on a little throne so he could get carried around. He didn't have to walk, he was too busy reading apparently or something. And come on, they still got his picture everywhere. Even though even the Communist Party there has largely discredited his legacy and torn apart his own personal edicts, they still put his picture up all the time. I don't even fucking understand it half the time with China. The Hong Kong protesters aren't even fighting like some people well, they're capitalist stooges, they're fighting for the CIA. They're not even asking for capitalism. They're not really rocking the boat at all. They're tired of people being deported off to the mainland to get thrown in gulags, and they're tired of their own government constantly killing and gassing out protesters even before they... And the reason that there are riots there is because of the heavy-handed treatment of law-abiding protests, where people were just standing there with signs. So yeah, there you go in a nutshell. People were antagonized to their limit, finally lost control and decided to throw some rocks, and then there was declared a riot, and they were all declared enemies of the people, guilty of treason by China. The government there's backed off on one of their demands. They've got 4 more to enforce, and they're sitting there busy singing the national anthem of the United States in order to sort of antagonize the Chinese government. It's interesting. It's funny, more and more Americans don't see the United States as a positive thing because, the left has convinced them that we're bad and wrong, colonialists, imperialists, we've destroyed the world, we're horrible people. I don't think that, but some morons do. Meanwhile, you've got people elsewhere in the world, they're more willing to fly the U.S. flag. It's probably safer to fly a U.S. flag in central Hong Kong right now than it would be in Portland. Think about that in perspective. That's about all. Peace out.